In today's video, I picked up a Chillblast Gaming PC that originally sold for £1,200 for just 50 quid. But we're going to find out if this actually is a good deal in 2026. Right, so this absolute unit of a computer that I've got here is my new, well, used Chillblast Gaming PC that I picked up off eBay for an astonishingly cheap £52. So for about 50 quid, this was once a very high-end computer. The only knowledge I have of Chillblast from back in the day was they partnered with the Yogscast and built all their custom computers, and they're a UK firm, but it looks like this machine was on retail for about £1,000 to £1,200 on launch. Now, launch of this machine, depending on when it was customized and if it was customized, puts it between 2013 to 2015 that these were on sale. It is absolutely huge. Now, I did have to go and collect this myself from London, but meant that I got a nice little day out in London. Why don't we actually take a look at what this is, because I don't know too much about it. I know that I didn't just get the computer, I've got keyboards, mice, I've got cables and subwoofers and things. Yeah, I mean, only one thing's been mentioned to me, which was the DVD drive doesn't work, which you can see behind this lovely front panel has some blue tech here, which I do respect because he did make sure to tell me it does still open with this button. These were really sought after back in the day. This is not only a bit of history, this is actually a really quite powerful computer that could be pretty good. So why don't we get this thing open? Why don't we take a little look inside? I can see it's got a graphics card in it. Some dust. I can see a lot of dust. This has got some serious weight to it. Well, it looks like a custom build of its era. Makes it a tad easier to see. We have the world's biggest cooler. Now, I think one of the things with Chillblast back in the day is all of their computers came overclocked from the factory. DVD drive we know about. Corsair CX Green, I quite like these. I've never had any problems. The only issues people did have back in the day, they'd get them to blow up by running the 430 watt one with R9 290s and AMD FX processors, and then was surprised it blew up when it was a 20 quid power supply from Amazon. It's got a Zotac graphics card, a reference model GTX 670. I don't think we've ever looked at standalone on the channel. It's got an SSD. Is it branded? Somewhere under the dust it might be. It may need a little bit of a cleanup because underneath all the dust I still can't see what kind of SSD we're running. Yeah, I don't think these have ever been taken out. Fans everywhere, and we have RAM, which of course is now worth a fortune. It is a 4GB Corsair kit. Makes sense, it's from the era where 8 gigs was plenty. Z87A, which makes this Haswell. Well, we've got to plug it in, haven't we? We've got to find out if it works. So why don't we plug this thing in and see what it actually does. Honestly, this may be better than what you can build on the custom market by itself, by just purely the fact it's an old pre-built. It must be said, I'm having some difficulty trying to film all this, given my limited working area. Is it going to give us a display? Come on. Rate up. I'm guessing someone's put Windows 10 on here. Hard drive, making hard drive noises. Not the worst I've heard. We can always check how many hours of use this thing's actually got, because usually something this modern will actually record those hours. It's taken a little while to get to Windows. It's sounding an awful lot like Windows is running on the hard drive. The amount of seeking it's doing right now. I mean, then again, it's also been sat in the guy's shed or garage for a little while. Very pleasant guy, by the way. Very pleasant. One of the best times I've had picking up a computer. No hassles whatsoever. Behind here, which way does this open? Opens this way. There's voltage controls, which I would have assumed was, or maybe it's got a fan controller built on. We'll find it Windows, right. Can we take a quick look at the specifications now we're here? No, we've got an i5 4670K, 8 gigs of RAM. Well, I mean, we know our graphics card is a 670. Is it running on the hard drive? No, the processor's at 100% though. In some way, it may just be hot. I don't know if this machine's ever been open. It's a Samsung SSD from back in the day. It is a 240 gig one, so 8 gigs of RAM and 240 gig SSD with those prices at the moment. It's already covered itself. But something funny is going on with that processor. We definitely need to look into the thermals. Given it's already running Windows 10, why don't we just run it straight through a benchmark and just see what we get through 3D Mark? Because then we'll know if the graphics card needs a clean up, the processor needs a clean up, the entire system needs a clean up. But Let's just recap this real quick. For 50 quid, we've got a high-end Z87 motherboard. We've got 8 gigs of RAM, which is an okay amount. Not exactly the best, but it's all right. A GTX 670, which was a nearing in on high-end card for its time. We have an overclocked Haswell processor, which should be more than decent. We've never really looked at Haswell too much, but it's got an IPC boost over Sandy Bridge that we have looked at plenty. A power supply that, given the stupid price of power supplies at the moment, is probably worth about 30 quid on the used market. 2 terabyte hard drive, 240 gig SSD, the world's largest cooler, and a case, honestly, probably put a dent in my fuel economy. But that's pretty good. Let's go run 3D Mark on this and see if we get some results. Well, I'm not too sure what Windows is doing, but I've come back and disk usage is at 100%. Can we open up Steam? Because it's the stupidest thing, but like, why don't we just do this in a really lazy way and just run it through 3D Mark and see the current state it's in? Just out of the box. All we've done is go there, pick up the computer, plug it in, and we're going to see just how it performs out of the box. I've not touched anything. The lack of working fans is interesting. I can't actually see where they're routed on here. Gotta put myself back in the mindset of 10 years ago when external fan controllers were hip. We're probably just running some sort of drivers. Driver date 2019. So yeah, it's not running the most up-to-date drivers, but it's running drivers. Yeah, it's now artifacting on the desktop. Now, Steam does run hardware acceleration, but you can see little bits up here artifacting. Are we making any progress? Is it just the disk usage crippling us here? It is funny. Oh yeah, no, the artifacting is getting worse. Look at it all over here. I genuinely think it could crash. You might not be able to hear this in the voiceover because it's very quiet, but the graphics card is clicking as it's going through. You can hear it just struggling to produce the frames it needs to. Kepler has never dealt with DirectX 12 well. It's still a good enough card, like it's not a terrible card. I'm sure we'll look at each of the individual components in their own right, in their own respective videos. But today is purely about the performance of this computer, the entire Chillblast Gaming PC. I'd also be curious to find out what kind of clock speed they were running this with out of the factory. I mean, there was speculation back in the day that they were getting bin samples, because back in the, I don't know, people still do it today. You probably don't need to as much with XFR and all of these technologies and boost technology going as far as it has. You could pay for tested bin chips. So depending on if these were getting bulk loads of bin chips, and then that was their USP. I mean, the Yogscast used these. That's the one thing I remember. I'm sure I will throw up a picture at some point of what they look like, but that's the main thing I remember, was them selling these computers through the brand. Yeah, it's still chugging away. I mean, the amount of artifacting going on right now, I would have fully expected it to crash, so I'm hoping it is just dirty contacts or damp or something like that. I mean, given the amount of dust in the computer, it could just need a really good clean. How is a Haswell i5 doing? Good, to be fair. Haswell earned its reputation. Personally, I think it's actually had a bit of a change in tune, because at the time it was seen as just another rebrand from Intel without anything all too exciting. 5% extra performance over Ivy Bridge. But at the same time, history has come into its own, where they are now dropping in price, and so many people got computers like this that they love them. Compared to the AMD FX chips, which you'll struggle to find anyone using one of those anymore, these are still holding their own. Even a little 4-core like this is still doing pretty good, especially given the fact this one can overclock. It's result time, and the artifacting is getting worse. I mean, it's scored pretty much bang on average, which makes sense because people running this configuration, probably people that bought computers like this, pre-built gaming PCs, never went over 30 degrees. Are we even surprised? And yeah, it looks like the processor is just running its stock frequencies. But I really do think this machine needs a bit of TLC. So why don't we start cleaning it up a little bit? The main thing we want to look at is what's going on with that graphics card. Can we get it maybe cleaned up? A little bit of a mini refurb, if you will. Some people, you know, they'd test these computers when they buy them. I prefer the adventure of seeing if this is a £50 bargain or a monumental mistake. Last time we ordered a £50 computer, it was a mistake. We ended up with a Dell XPS that was meant to be the highest end one and ended up with, well, the lowest end one they sold. Well, that doesn't mean that this one's good. This one, I mean, the processor that doesn't get over 30 degrees is insanity to me. Bit excessive on the cooling, but maybe this was a workstation machine. You never know. It's about as original as you can get for a computer like this. Right. The 670. Never been... This is a doodad. A doodad has fallen out of the graphics card, or somewhere near it. Okay, how are we looking down in the board itself? Thermal paste is baked. Yeah, that's long since stopped doing anything, but it's transferring heat. I'm really hoping it's just those PCIe lanes, but we'll get the dust out of the system as well. It's kind of relevant though, because if you do go and buy one of these used pre-builts, a pre-built is going to be bought by someone that hasn't built it themselves. So it likely will need a good chunk of cleaning. Initial assumptions about the CPU cooler. Yes, watch the dust rain from this. They certainly got a good few years out of this, because that is... I mean, it's not built up inside the heatsink, it's all just resting. I am just going to clean off my monitor that's now covered in GTX poo and dust. That is much cleaner and much nicer. Honestly, as far as GTX 670s go, that's pretty clean now. That looks pretty bang up perfect. That's a nice condition graphics card. Now we just hope that it was just dirty, and that's why it was artifacting, otherwise we're in for a bit more of a world of trouble. But let's give it a test and see what it does this time. Now, it is worth noting that around this point, my microphone stopped working for a few minutes, so the audio is mostly unintelligible. So what actually happened was we put the system back together, we plugged it all in, and the artifacting had stopped. So it did appear the main issue with the graphics card was nothing major, it was just dry thermal paste and a load of dust buildup on the contacts that made it appear that the graphics card was artifacting. This also explains why it was able to get through all benchmarks absolutely fine. It was just giving us display problems. It wasn't the HDMI port or anything like that, because I did test off-screen some different cables, so it's nothing to do with the outputs, it was purely due to dust buildup. I did run it through another 3D Mark benchmark, this time Firestrike, where we got a much better result because one, the graphics card wasn't running as hot as it was before, and on the other hand, it's also a DirectX 11 benchmark, which is kind of what this PC would have absolutely dominated at when it was built. So I decided at this point, the best course of action, given our limited 8GB of RAM, would be to get rid of a standard Windows 10 install and replace it with a Windows 11 IoT install, which does deal with RAM management, especially on lower RAM systems, really rather well. It's also good evidence that even these older computers that you can pick up quite cheap on eBay can still run the latest and greatest operating system from Microsoft. I just wouldn't go with normal Windows 11, I would go with the IoT version that we're going to use today. Right, let's install everything. Yeah, I mean, this is all going okay. I mean, it's running Windows 11. Yes, we could run Linux. We have a Kepler graphics card. Kepler does not run Linux particularly well. We've already tried a Maxwell, which is better than this, and it was meh. So we can always look at Linux on it. It would do better if we put something like this in there. This would transform this as a Linux PC, but it didn't come with an R9 Nano in it. It came with a GTX 670. Let's get on with some overclocking. It's BIOS time. One thing I am curious to check out first though, what is going on with those fans? I'm also curious on how the cable management looks behind here. It's okay. This looks to be all our fans running off a Molex header. So we got Molex to fan. There we are. See, on the front here, I'm sure I'll insert some footage, is a little switch which has got voltage controls. The reason it's not doing anything is it's clearly come loose off this. I like the cable management they've done, but clearly the reason the fans don't work is someone's pulled this front off, and then it's cable tied so in place that you can't actually get any wiggle room. A metric ton of dust. Is this just a filter? Does this just... let's go. See what I mean? I understand why they've cable managed it like this, but at the same time, it means the slightest knock or nudge and the fans won't work. You got a little voltage control, which is why the fan's not working. Also, for those that don't know, this is a rebranded Fractal design case, so it was actually a pretty good case back in the day. I don't want to say built different, because let's be honest, they weren't exactly built different, but they were built for use in a different era where, you know what? Everyone had to be running RAID for some reason. You spent money, you got RAID. I suppose because SSDs weren't as cheap as they are now, which would make a lot of sense. That should be just enough space for us to clip this back in. So that should fix our fan situation. We've got two fans on, front and rear. Okay, one of them's turned on. Okay, these connectors have just been pulled. That's a stupid amount of airflow coming from that. So that's 12 volt, 7 volt, 5 volt. 12 volt does begin to sound like a plane wanting to take off. I only really want the fans on for the sake of airflow. I mean, we've got more dust. Oh, probably because the fans are now working. That'll be the dust that I dislodged in the fans when I cleaned them actually coming out. There's a lot of options. I cannot find what I'm looking for. Where is my multiplier? Am I being stupid? Is it just in advanced or something? Ratio first. Start tuning. Yes. 4.5. Okay, that is now running at 4.5 GHz. What kind of voltage? Okay, I think I now understand how overclocking on this board works. 4.5 GHz, I'm happy with that, it'll work. It's just graphics card overclocking, and we're sorted. Right, so if we increase the power limit, is that going to give us any extra performance? Yes, it immediately gave us a lot of extra performance. Can the core clock go up anymore? I think we've crashed the computer. It's no worries, these things happen. And we're done. So we've got the system overclocked on the processor, overclocked on the graphics card, the RAM's at stock speeds, but honestly, it's not exactly great RAM. So we'll run through 3D Mark, and, well, we'll change these clocks first, then we'll run it through 3D Mark, and we'll go from there. I think I went a little bit too high on the memory. Not the end of the world, though. And that is absolutely everything all set up. So the system's been cleaned, so thermals are no longer a problem. There's a section on that later. And we also have the system running quite a nice overclock that is now stable. I did have to tweak around a few settings at the end, and mostly reduce a few things off the memory because I had gone a little bit overboard. But just what are the full specifications of this cheap Chillblast gaming PC that was once just north of £1,000? Well, you get a Core i5 4670K that we are now running at 4.5 GHz, and this is actually the settings they would have used from the factory. See, most Chillblast PCs came pre-overclocked, so this is pretty much how it would have been running when it showed up at your doorstep back on launch. Our graphics card seems to be spec'd at a GTX 670, which is why it took me so long to find a listing that's reminiscent of this, because it does appear that when they started launching Haswell cards, well, Haswell processors into these systems, they replaced it with the GTX 700 series. So this seems to be a weird middle ground PC where they were still using some of the last generation graphics cards. We have 8GB of DDR3, which was plenty at the time, but is a little bit low by today's standards, and this PC was available in some form or another from 2013 to 2015. Now, of course, you could get this with Ivy Bridge, you could get it with newer graphics cards. It's a PC custom builder. They updated the specifications as they went, and of course, you could request different parts if you needed them. So we've ended up with a 2TB hard drive and a 240GB SSD as a boot drive, which seems to be being an option, quite an expensive option back in the day, to be fair, and they did also offer RAID setups if you wanted those instead. We are running Windows 11 IoT, which is the cut down version, so you get nothing more than Windows, a start bar, and an internet browser. It has really good RAM management, and it also doesn't have all of the bloat that may be taking away from what little RAM we do actually have. I paid around £52 for this PC, and honestly, custom builds like this are going for very similar money. You just have to go and pick them up, because most of the time with cases this large, they're not going to want to ship them. Makes sense, this thing is very huge and very heavy. Now we can get back to the matter at hand though, which is how does our performance compare now the system is cleaned and overclocked out of when we just started using it from the box, which is something you might want to keep in mind, because if you are going down this route to get a computer, especially one of these older high-end systems, keep in mind they were often, in this case, overclocked from the factory, or were designed to be overclocked to some capacity to achieve the performance that they were being sold for. At least in 3D Mark's Firestrike, we went from 5,747 to nearly a 1,000 point increase up to 6,708. This makes a lot of sense, this is kind of the era this PC was designed for, and over in 3D Mark's Time Spy, we went from 1,850 to 2,174. That's not so much the overclock not being effective, so much as these are dated components and the architectures are likely struggling. And if you are thinking maybe this is something to do with the graphics card or the processor, well, in fact, we saw the same increase on both. So in terms of processor, we saw around a 17% uplift, and in terms of graphics card, well, we saw the same 17% uplift overall. So really, we are limited on architecture here. We have lacking cores, and of course, we've got a lacking Kepler architecture. If you're wondering how this processor, the 4670K, compares to others that are on the market, I've done my best to put some into an actual graph, and it gives you an idea of how lackluster the upgrades were going from the previous couple of generations, such as Sandy Bridge, which which, although scoring 2,328, you've got to keep in mind that i5-2400 is quite a low-clocked OEM variant. If you had an i5-2500K, you'd likely be seeing a similar score to what we're getting on this 4670. Generally though, in terms of modern processors, if you can still call these modern, it's sort of similar to a 4-core Ryzen chip. The Ryzen 3 comes to mind, which is actually a processor that someone I know uses every day for competitive games like Counter-Strike, multitasking on their computer. They've just not had any reason to upgrade away from it. So, you know, it is still up there with processors that people are still using today. So that's not exactly taking away from the performance, just it's a very middling processor by today's standards. It doesn't hold that legendary reputation it once did. Then again, you could overclock it further than this. I've been quite lazy and I just wanted something that would work. In terms of the graphics side performance of the system, how does it compare to other graphics cards? Well, it is doing about as well as I expect a Kepler card to do. You're looking at around half the performance of a GTX 1060 3GB. In terms of competing AMD cards of its era, the 7970, which is also a cheap card that sells for around a similar price used, well, you're looking at a sizable uplift there. Real-world performance, at least in the modern day, puts it around the R9 370, you know, the 7870 rebrand, and, I mean, there's not really much else to say here. The 670 is not exactly doing fantastic in 2026, but we've never also looked at it standalone, so I can't comment on it too much at the moment. Now let's get this all out the way really quickly. General usage on the machine is absolutely fine. It is a Haswell Core i5 that's been overclocked, is running stripped down Windows 11, and it's also running it on an SSD. That is pretty much a recipe for a quite speedy PC, even by today's standards. The something that's also quite inherent to the ring bus architecture is just how snappy they do actually feel. Now this system is going to struggle in a few instances. Namely, we have 8GB of RAM, and Windows 11 IoT can only perform so much magic. Kepler has long since been out of driver support for about a year and a half now, and honestly, I have very little experience testing it beyond the GTX 780 that we got for cheap a little while ago, so I'm not too up to date on how the 670 is actually performing. And you've got to keep in mind, a lot of new titles do use new APIs that this card was never designed for. It doesn't deal with Vulkan or DirectX 12 particularly gracefully. But keeping in mind this is a 50 quid gaming system, I do want to put this system through some of the most popular games out there, some new titles, and just see how far it'll actually go. And the only way to do that will be with the benchmarks. Starting off the benchmarks is a bit of a tricky one for this PC. GTA 5 Enhanced Edition, despite all of the perks it does have, is more RAM heavy, more VRAM heavy, and it is also a DirectX 12 title, which should spell a recipe for disaster for this older system. We were able to manage the game with high settings plus HPIO in a 1080p resolution, and this was with TAA enabled, something that is worth mentioning because it does have a sizable performance hit on these Kepler cards, something it doesn't have on the equivalent AMD cards of the era. We saw 51 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 45 FPS, which overall is not too bad of a result. When you move into the world of online, which is more intensive in every way, it's still a better optimized version of the game though than the old legacy version was becoming, and we saw 43 FPS on average, although the frame times did go slightly out the window, with 1% lows now down to 34 FPS. This was only during built-up sessions. Keep in mind that when you're under 16 players, the game does still net you some performance increase, not as much as the legacy version does, but at the end of the day, GTA 5 Enhanced Edition, at least the online part, does seem to still work okay, so both single player and online with the Enhanced Edition still work on this Chillblast PC. If you wanted a rough idea of how this PC performed back in the day and why someone would have gone with the Nvidia option, well, during the DirectX 11 era, they were pretty much the best choice you could make. There's no getting around it, because here is the legacy version of GTA 5 running with very high settings and Nvidia PCSS shadows in a 1080p resolution, and we saw 74 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 68 FPS, which gives you an idea of how this system would have performed back in the day. Pretty much any title that would have come out, you're looking at very close settings to maxing out the game entirely. Honestly, you probably could get away with enabling all of the advanced options and maybe sneaking in a higher resolution if you didn't mind something closer to a 30 FPS experience. So that gives you an idea of how it performs. Over in the online version of GTA 5 Legacy, we were running with the same set of settings and now saw 58 FPS on average, with okayish frame times down to 50 FPS. This was still a 20 FPS loss in the overall average, which is something you'd expect in larger lobbies, but it is worth noting that in smaller lobbies, your frame rate pretty much stays the exact same as single player. So despite our limited RAM and our limited VRAM, in these older titles, you're going to be having absolutely no problems whatsoever. Next up, we have Counter-Strike 2, which was certainly an interesting one because I know 4-core processors can struggle a little bit here, and a Kepler graphics card is not exactly going to be doing all too fantastically, especially with its limited VRAM. But with competitive settings and a 1080p resolution, you don't have to wait for the stutters to stop like competing AMD cards of the era do, and we saw 126 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 87 FPS during the built-in benchmark map. It is worth noting these frame rates were the same during offline gameplay, they were higher than this during actual competitive matches, and they were lower than this during online casual games, mostly because there's more going on, the processor's having to do more, the graphics card's having to do more, and as the player count dropped, your frame rate went up. Not exactly all too surprising there, but you're pretty much covered for all instances that aren't incredibly busy lobbies. So yeah, I'd say Counter-Strike 2, decently playable, maybe not the most competitive experience, but it's certainly enough to get by, on a system that only needs a couple of upgrades to be a little bit better. Fortnite certainly was a weird one to benchmark because the settings the game says we should use is a 20% resolution scale in 1080p and also to use DirectX 12, which looked hideous and didn't run particularly well either way. I utilised the Performance DirectX 11 mode, which they call Legacy, in a 1080p resolution and also enabled a 60 FPS frame rate cap. You could run the game at 120 FPS, but the system does begin to struggle a little bit, and does begin to stutter a lot more. As the game went on and you played it longer, stutters would disappear at the 60 FPS cap, but they were still there slightly. I tried to play through most of an entire game, not that I'm very good at it, and I was able to get along with it okay. Fortnite is one of those games that really doesn't do well on these older graphics cards, and the legacy options only really exist to try and get them to run on these cards. The Core i5 was definitely more than capable of keeping to a 60 FPS target, but it did look like our Kepler-based graphics card wasn't having the best of a time. So Fortnite was playable, but you're gonna have to stick with these settings. I don't know, you could see players very easily at these settings, so maybe that is an advantage. BeamNG is an interesting one to try and test on both the CPU and GPU at the same time. We're able to manage the game with medium and high settings and the traffic enabled in a 1080p resolution, with 41 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 36 FPS. Now it is worth noting here that one of the main issues we were running into is just how long everything would take to load in. It wasn't as noticeably bad as something like a Core 2 Duo where you might be waiting 10 minutes for the game to be playable, but you were still waiting anywhere from 20 seconds up to a full minute while everything updated and loaded in. Then again, once it had loaded in, the performance was absolutely fine. You could enable the police chases, you could enable more traffic, you could pretty much just keep the game going along with these settings, and you'd see the game bounce between 30 to 50 FPS most of the time. Simpler maps and scenarios would push you over the 60 FPS threshold, but these most intensive of maps, well, they'd look like this. It's also worth mentioning that the RAM, well, that could be a limit if you started pushing more and more cars and could crash the game if you turn that up too high. Then again, RAM is quite an easy fix, or would have been an easy fix, if prices hadn't gone through the roof. Here's one that no one thought would probably run at all on this graphics card, with Cyberpunk 2077. Now, with low settings in 720p, we saw 43 FPS and 1% lows down to 29 FPS during the built-in benchmark, which, as we all know, is remarkably deceptive of the real-world performance. Until sometimes it isn't, because on some cards, this is the exact type of performance you'll get in-game. So through a little bit of gameplay, it was more than controllable. We saw the exact same frame rate when just going around causing chaos and causing trouble and actually playing through the game. Now, it is worth noting that large explosions would dip you down just south of 30 FPS and were notable as a slight blip in the frame rate, but honestly, if you were playing this game, a solid 30 FPS cap, and you're still going to be able to get away with Cyberpunk 2077,
I mean, when you actually think this PC cost about £1,100 when it was bought, it doesn't sound that impressive, but for a 50 quid computer, that doesn't sound too bad, does it? PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds was a weird one, because it didn't matter whether we're using all low settings, all very low settings, or a mixture of medium settings in there. It didn't matter whether we're using DirectX 11, 11.1 or 12. I really do think it's the 8GB of RAM here that was causing us no end of trouble. You see, after some matches, I'd be in them for a bit, I'd do a bit of tweaking around with the settings, and with external FPS caps and things like that, I could get the game locked at 60. You just had to lock the game at 70 FPS in-game, and then lock it to 60 FPS externally, and that would get the game running fine. And then it would run for a bit, and if it didn't crash, you were in for a good time. But if it did crash, you'd go through and these settings might not work for some reason. So PUBG, I'm not exactly going to say is playable, because it was about 1 out of 3 matches where you could actually go through it and call it playable. And even then, you'd still have to go through and configure the game externally with an FPS cap to make it playable. So unfortunately, PUBG, yeah, it's the 8 gigs of RAM, and it's just not going to work okay. City Skylines, one of the most played city builders and always in the top 100 on Steam, was running pretty much as I expected it to on this system. This is a Unity-based game, so does actually like single-core performance, which is something we do have. Lacking in core count isn't too much of a problem. So we saw 41 FPS overall, with 1% lows down to 35 FPS with high settings enabled. And this was just taken from about 20-25 minutes of going through, building up the city and carrying on. So City Skylines, not too much of an issue. This is the type of system this game was always designed to run on, especially when you factor in that we're running it with high settings. Now I could see larger cities being a problem due to either the VRAM or the limited RAM on the system, but for now with our standard benchmark town, which is growing day by day, it's going absolutely okay. So City Skylines was playable, and during the expansion I was doing there was no slowdown compared to that of just starting the game, so we'll call that one playable. Always requested as a benchmark, we have Rust, which I ran with the low preset in 1080p. Worth noting that the low preset does not actually drop all settings to low, so yes, it can look worse than this. We saw 60 FPS with an external frame cap in place, which was a complete necessity to keep the frame rate smooth, as otherwise the game was a stuttering mess, but with this in place it was a lot better. Once everything had loaded in, we saw averages of 60 FPS with 1% lows down to 55 FPS, which is really rather good for this game. The frame pacing can be very hit or miss system to system. I know it's had optimizations over the years, but it has also become a lot more intensive with those optimizations. So Rust was playable. You're going to have to play it with lower settings that don't look too great, but it didn't seem like the processor was struggling anywhere near that much. So really, with a better graphics card, you could probably achieve, I'm going to say, a better frame rate than this, or better frame rate and better visuals. Running Hitman with any higher resolution or any higher settings would cause it to crash. I'd like to say this is because of the Kepler graphics card, but honestly, once again, it could be the RAM on the system causing a few problems there. But still, with these settings, we were able to run through, complete the benchmark, and I can also confirm it doesn't crash in-game either. We used predominantly low settings in 720p, which in this game doesn't look too bad at all. It looks a blind sight better than Rust does, even at 1080p there. And we saw 56 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 47 FPS. Oddly appropriate 1% lows, to be honest. Once again, Kepler doesn't deal with DirectX 12 particularly all too well, so compared to the competing AMD cards that could have been in a system like this, it's not the best performance, but it does still work, which is kind of admirable. A personal favourite for me, so one that I'd want to ensure does run on my £50 but was once £1,100 computer, with RimWorld running at default settings in a 1080p resolution. Now, because this game is still quite single-threaded in some areas, the high clock speed and the decently high IPC of the Haswell chip meant that we could run the game at a 3x speed with virtually no slowdown whatsoever. I'd imagine that once you start fiddling around with the developer options to enable the unlimited speed up, you'd see some frame drops, but as it stands at the moment, the 3x speed up option can pretty much guarantee you colonies that would go from the mid to late game with very little in the way of slowdown. Once again, of course, busy maps and high pawn count areas are going to affect the tick rate. You're not running this on a supercomputer, it's RimWorld running on a Haswell i5. But still, from the little bit of gameplay that I got, actually quite a decent chunk of gameplay that I got, I don't think it dropped the frame rate once. So I'd say that's a pretty good experience from a pretty good game. Fallout 4 Anniversary, well, it's not exactly the type of game that would have been running on the system because this has been updated for modern graphics cards, and it does have a few downsides. Now, the frame pacing before this in the original patch of Fallout, at least the original patch of Fallout 4, was never too great even on Nvidia cards of the era, but you would see a higher average than this because for some reason the VRAM management on the Anniversary Edition does seem to be ever so slightly worse. Probably because it's targeting modern cards that come with anywhere from 4 gigs up to, 16 gigs of VRAM? So, you know, we've come a long way from these old 2 gigabyte cards. But still, with high settings, we saw 47 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 39 FPS. It's worth noting that when you were in smaller areas, or not much had actually loaded in yet, the game would run at a perfectly locked 60 FPS, which was good to see, and did raise my hopes slightly too high for when combat started and we were down to the mid-40s. This one I kind of always expected to work. I was trying to be a tad too intensive by running the fabulous settings at first, which proved too much for both the graphics card and the processor in the system, and the RAM, oddly enough. That's actually quite intensive on the RAM. Who would have thought that the highest settings in Minecraft could be RAM intensive? Anyway, I've said that too much now. Once you drop back to fancy settings, the game runs at a perfectly locked 60 FPS frame rate, which it will not stray away from. Shouldn't be any surprise that Minecraft is still running on a PC like this. Once again, it's from the era where you could go onto the website to order this, and you could order a PC for the Yogscast, so it seems oddly appropriate it deals with this game well, even just over a decade from its build date really. So this PC's doing okay, and it's running Minecraft fine, something that you should expect from a Kepler card. They were always good at dealing with this and OpenGL and things like that. So yes, Minecraft works fine, even with the latest version. But finally, can it run Crysis? Which was probably an appropriate question to ask back in the day to see just how far your Haswell PC, your £1,100 computer, could run the 2008 title that was Crysis. I don't know why we're still talking about it today, they were talking about it back then, it is appropriate. Very high settings with DirectX 10 in a 1080p resolution returned us an average of 71 FPS. This game only really utilises 2 cores, but we have 2 Haswell cores running at 4.5 GHz available to it, so there's plenty of spare processing power in the background if we needed that as well. 1% lows were down to 53 FPS when lots was going on, and when not much was going on, it would stabilise at an average even higher than this. So yes, it can run Crysis, and honestly, if you turn on your PC back in 2013, 2014, whenever this thing's from, and saw this, you'd probably go, you know what, that's pretty good. But then again, it's also dealt with a lot of modern titles too. So how was the overall performance? Well, if you look at it in the context of it being a £50 PC that you've just got a hold of, you're able to run a lot of the popular titles on Steam straight out of the box. Well, you have to do a bit of overclocking and a bit of cleaning, but you're able to run a lot of titles without having to swap and change any components, which is pretty nice. And then again, the games that it runs well, it does tend to run really well. And on the other hand, I suppose if you're someone that bought this PC brand new, well, at this point you're getting, your 12th year out of this computer, and it's still playing a lot of the popular titles out there, which is pretty decent. On the other hand, though, as a selection of parts, the 8GB of RAM really does hold us back in a lot of titles. A lot of the stuttering and frame rate problems, as much as I want to blame Kepler and its lack of modern API support, is probably more down to the 8GB of RAM, which is an easy thing to rectify, but you're looking at spending a little bit more money than you'd like on even DDR3. Then again, the Kepler graphics card itself, I've never taken out a GTX 670 to just benchmark it by itself, so it's difficult for me to place the performance, but it really is struggling in the modern day. Whether it's due to VRAM or just architectural constraints and the fact it doesn't support Vulkan and DirectX 12 very well, you end up with some odd crashes in places. For example, Red Dead Redemption 2, I want to say this is a mixture of the low RAM and the graphics card. You could load the benchmark, but it would crash almost at random, and the same with gameplay. Baldur's Gate 3 would crash on launch even when utilising DirectX 11, something I really wasn't expecting, and there were a couple more cases, even Bannerlord, you could get in-game, but the moment you actually went to load the benchmark or a custom battle, it would crash when you went over a certain amount of players. That really does sound more RAM-related though. So the overall performance is decent. I mean, some standouts definitely are being able to play GTA 5 whether you want the Enhanced Edition or the Legacy version. You're able to play both online absolutely fine, Counter-Strike 2 and even BeamNG. Then again, the Core i5 didn't seem to really struggle in all too many games, and those that it was struggling with, probably because the components is also paired with as well, you could just cap the frame rate and leave a good bit of headroom so it wasn't having to constantly work at 100% usage. So the i5 seems to still be hanging in there, and to be fair, can return a decently competitive frame rate in Counter-Strike, which is something I wasn't expecting too much from an old 4-core processor. Another aspect that's worth looking at is most people that are looking at an old PC like this, and when you see the absolute size of it, these fractal design cases are not just huge, they are actually surprisingly heavy. They're definitely heavier than the Corsair cases of the era, which I was more familiar with. When it comes to airflow, surprisingly decent. I mean, the case alone is probably worth what I paid to someone that wants something with this much hard drive space. Personally, I've never been too much of a fan because, I mean, let's be honest, I just get higher capacity hard drives, but I can see the appeal of being able to have this much storage and expandability. It is nice. When it comes to the thermals of the system, well, even at its very worst, running Firmark and a CPU-Z stress test at the same time, we saw 83 degrees on the graphics card, 70 degrees on the processor, and 34 degrees as a system temperature. When it came to gaming, the processor, let's be honest, these fans never ramped up once. That cooler is absolutely huge. We saw 51 degrees, 79 degrees on the GTX 670 while gaming, and thermals at 30 degrees for the system temperature. Idle was all hovering between 30 and 40 degrees on all components, and before we cleaned this system, well, the processor didn't get too much hotter than it did once it was cleaned, it was just a bit of dust, but the graphics card was nearing it at 94 degrees. And also keep in mind, those results weren't even with an overclock. That is just how hot the GTX 670 was running under sustained load with that old thermal paste. So if you're getting something like this as the base of your computer, you're gonna be better off cleaning it to be able to at least run under 100 degrees or around that sort of mark. One thing that might surprise some people though is despite having a 750 watt power supply in this system, Kepler was quite a power hungry thing and was predominantly the main load on the system, but with the figures taken from the wall, running Firmark and CPU-Z stressing the system out to the maximum, we saw the system use just shy of 300 watts, which is much lower than I thought it would be. In terms of gaming, we saw this drop to 261 watts, during light usage it was just under 50 watts, and at idle it was 28 watts. This is a lot more efficient than I was expecting, and I suppose that's the one thing Haswell had going for it, is I'm fairly sure it was a die shrink down to 22 nanometers. I'll have to double check this right, but it was at least a die shrink that meant that it did use less power. So despite our overclock, we didn't need too much voltage to get there, this system doesn't use much power. So I mean, it's not exactly amazing, but at the end of the day, you know, people expect so much power consumption from PC components that I don't think we realised how good we had it back then when we were complaining about a graphics card using 180, 190 watts or something like that. We didn't realise how much further away and much more power we could end up using in the future. Now, what other factors are there to consider? Well, the PC technically does have Nvidia's NVENC provided on the Kepler-based graphics cards, but in this case it wasn't working. I'd imagine it's likely because I'm running too modern of a version of OBS, but it's also worth mentioning that I did try older drivers on the system and they made no difference. Kepler is at a dead end, and I'm not complaining about the drivers they are running because they are stable, but generally, they're just old. It's an old architecture, it's difficult to do much with it. It's not like a Fermi where it was built for the future a little bit and you can give them one last push at the end. It was a graphics card built for its generation, a generation that's now over, whereas the AMD cards of the era, which people still look fondly at today, especially as a viable budget option, you just don't see any performance enhancements from DirectX 12 or Vulkan. You see it as a hindrance. So DirectX 11, this system is amazing, but I suppose there's also the aspect of trying to record with the processor, and I did try and go through OBS and set up a little bit of recording, and there was a couple of clips I went through, I think a 3000 kilobyte per second stream quality, just to see if the PC could handle it. I think you've got QuickSync built into the processor, so you've got NVENC support on there, and you've also got Intel's QuickSync built in, if you went through and spent the time fiddling and getting them all to work together. So yeah, the system works, there's a few extra things you can do with it. It can do media playback well, it can do editing okay, it can do recording okay. It's a very solid PC from its era. It's one that was very expensive for its era, mostly because it was custom built and overclocked from the factory, but at the same time, it's lasted the test of time because of this. So there we have it. The £1,100, £1,200, the well over £1,000 Chillblast Gaming PC, reviewed and tested, now it's finally hit its £50 value. And honestly, I could see pre-builts like this going up in price as people search for a base to build a system they can actually afford to put together. I mean, DDR3 is going up in price, but I mean, even DDR4 is going up to unmanageable levels where it just shouldn't be selling at that price because people are dropping down a stage from DDR5 to DDR4, and then some people from DDR4 to DDR3. So I could see these higher-end DDR3 systems going up in price, because let's be honest, you slap a bit of RAM in this, you slap a new graphics card in this, boom, you've got a gaming computer. That would more than handle modern tasks. I mean, at the end of the day, one of the reasons I did buy this system is we can finally take a look back at those Haswell i5s by themselves, both stock and overclocked in a dedicated video, probably quite a long video because I've got a lot of testing in mind. It also gives us a good base for other components to test, like that GTX 670, that'll be very interesting. And of course, I don't doubt that some people are going to say, can you upgrade this PC or maybe make it into a modern gaming beast? And I'm sure we will, and there's also going to be a minority of people saying, why didn't you run Linux? If enough people comment that, I will install Linux on here, and we will see just how bad it actually does. Kepler performs pretty mediocre on Windows these days, and it's even worse over on Linux. So if people keep asking, I'll do it. It just won't be very good. Anyway, thank you all very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I mean, it's been very enjoyable to make, going up to get the computer, testing something that I'm actually a little bit nostalgic for, this era of high-end pre-builts that, you know, I used to see and be like, wow, I wish I could afford one of those, and end up buying an FX 4300 that I could afford. But at the end of the day, it's been an interesting one, so we'll definitely be following up on this computer. So thank you all very much for watching, and good night.